Mm. I think we can start now. Thanks all for joining our last IMBES summer conference series in 2021. I'm Yunji Park, a research chair of the IMBES training board and previous postdoc at Stanford. And I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, we'd like to remind you that we will be hosting 7th biennial IMBES conference held in Montreal, Canada for July 21st to 23rd. Please mark on your calendar. Today we have two guest speakers, Dr. Courtney Pollack and Dr. Melina Uncapher. Dr. Pollack is a senior researcher at the Center of Optimized Student Support at Boston College, a research affiliate in the Gabriele Lab at MIT, and adjunct faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is interested in understanding and reducing challenges to learning. In one research area, she studies the effectiveness of a whole child intervention on student achievements. And in the second line, she focuses on mathematical cognitions and the intersection of mathematics and reading domains. And next guest speaker will be Dr. Uncapher. She is currently an assistant professor at UCSF and a director of education program at Neuroscape. Her work mainly focuses on understanding how attention affects learning and memory and applying research to real-world problems, including education, technology, and law. At this time, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Pollack. She will give a talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will have a brief Q&A sessions with her before we pass over to Dr. Melina Uncapher. If you have any questions you'd like to get down in the chat, questions that you'd like to get down in the chat, and while the speakers are presenting, I will moderate those questions at the end after the talk and read those out to the speakers. So wait a minute. Please wait for a while, and please feel free to put your questions in the chat during the talk. And then, yeah, I think I need to hand over to Dr. Pollack. I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Let me see. We should be all set here. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay. So thank you so much to everyone for joining, and also a very big thank you to IMBES for this award. I'm so honored to be here and to be able to share some snapshots of some of my work with you today. So I want to frame this talk with two broad guiding questions that frame the work that I do. The first is, what are barriers to learning math and how can we remove them? And this has guided both my teaching and also my research in mathematical cognition, not just because I'm interested in children having good experiences in the classroom, which I am, but also because math is important for life outcomes like educational attainment overall, lifetime earnings, and health decision-making. And when I answer questions related to this area, I'm often zooming in to focus on particular aspects of math learning. But I'm also interested in zooming out and thinking about how math cognition and learning are related to other learning domains like reading. So for example, the connection between arithmetic processing and phonological processing, or the co-occurrence of math and reading difficulties. And also some other learning factors like socio-emotional characteristics that are related to math and to reading. So today I'd like to talk about two areas of work, one that falls into each of these buckets. So first, I'd like to talk about a connection between math and reading, which is how are letters processed in a math context. So for example, when letters of the alphabet are brought into a numerical or mathematical context, like when X has a value like 7. And second, kind of zooming out to talk about how motivation, anxiety, and competence are related within and across reading and math domains. So I'll start by talking about how letters are processed in a math context. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that and why I think that's important. So this work is really grounded in a robust literature that shows that processing number symbols, so identifying number symbols and being able to work with them fluently, is really a foundational math skill. So that's related to math competence across the lifespan. This might look something like seeing a number like 8 and a number like 2 and being able to determine which is greater. But it doesn't have to be just this. So another way that it could look to work with number symbols is to see a number word like 8 and a digit like 2 and determine whether they represent the same or different value. And I'm also interested in thinking about more scenarios like this inequality. X plus 2 is greater than 3. And what are the values that X can take on? And so how is it that children think about seeing a letter in a math context like that and understanding what it stands for? So as this example shows, digits and letters are both used in math, and this is really challenging. This is a pervasive problem for students, and how to really understand the mechanisms that underlie this challenge and how to ameliorate it is still very much an open question. And there are many hypotheses about why this might be why there might be this difficulty, but I'll share one that I'm particularly interested in, which is that students bring their prior knowledge of letters from reading into math class. And so I wanted to ask, how might this prior knowledge create challenges to working with letters in math? And this was a study that I did as part of my doctoral work. So I anchored it in the type of work that I just mentioned a minute ago, seeing a number word and a digit and determining whether they're the same or different. But I wanted to modify it. So I took this task and I coupled it with a training study. And the idea behind the training study was that participants would learn new symbol-referent connections for letters and for novel symbols. So for example, they would learn to associate the letters in the letter column with the digit, their corresponding digits, and separately their novel symbols with the same corresponding digits. And then they would complete an adapted same different task. So they would see letters and digits and determine whether they represent the same or different value, and also novel symbols and digits, and determine if they were the same or different value. And what I wanted to do was compare performance across these two conditions. The logic here is that the tasks are the same, but in one, there are prior associations, right, in the letter condition, and in the other, there aren't. And so I recruited adolescents to make these judgments, and I recorded their performance. What I found was that same different judgments took longer with letters. So in this graph, on the y-axis, there's response time, and on the x-axis is response time for letters and for novel symbols. And as the figure shows, judgments with letters were 80 milliseconds slower on average than with novel symbols. But there were no differences in accuracy when making judgments with letters or with novel symbols. And I took this to be an indication of some kind of processing cost to working with letters. But I also wondered, is it that perhaps adolescents have only beginning or a little bit of experience working with letters in a numerical or mathematical context? So I wanted to replicate or see if I could replicate this study in adults who had greater math experience and math knowledge. And so I did this study with Gavin Price in the Numerical Brain Lab as part of my postdoc there. And we essentially ran the same study where participants learned these novel associations and then made same different judgments with them. And I found something similar, that same different judgments take longer with letters than with novel symbols. So here you see that this processing cost is actually a bit greater, 104 milliseconds slower on average for same different judgments with letters than with novel symbols. And we didn't really analyze accuracy here because everyone was performing really well, essentially at ceiling. But we wanted to go further, besides replicating this processing cost, if we did, to probe some of the potential mechanisms that might underlie it. And in our paper, we go through a set of them, but I would like to just highlight one of them here. So we were interested in thinking about the initial symbol-referent mapping as a potential mechanism. So in order to do that, we wanted to really dig in, not just to the same different task, but also to the actual training task that participants were engaging in. So let me tell you a little bit more about how that task is set up. So they were paired associate learning tasks, and participants did this separately for novel symbols and for letters, but I'm just going to use letters here as an example. So first, they were given the list of associations, and after some minimum thresholds, they were able to study the list for as long as they wanted. Then they started the actual learning trials, where they would randomly see one of the new symbols, either letters or novel symbols, and then they would have a choice screen where they needed to match it with its value. They were then given some feedback, whether they were correct or not, and regardless, the right association was reinforced. So in order to think about symbol-referent mapping as a potential mechanism, we looked at several different measures related to this task. First, we looked to see whether there were accuracy differences between training with letters and with novel symbols, and accuracy was similar. We also looked at exposure, and by that I mean the number of trials it took for participants to complete the learning task, because there was an accuracy threshold, a high accuracy threshold that they had to meet, and it took them a similar number of trials in order to meet that threshold. But then we looked at, again, response time on learning trials compared across the two conditions. And we saw that it took, on average, learning trials took longer in the letter condition than in the novel symbol condition. We additionally looked at variation in response time in the learning trials for letters compared to novel symbols. And we found that there was greater variation in response times when learning with letters than novel symbols. So this study, originally I had been thinking that the processing cost may arise from retrieval of these learned associations during the same different judgments. But these results suggested that there may be a difficulty in the initial learning of symbol-referent connections. So to return to the overview, this is a really kind of zoomed in look, right, at a very particular way that we see the reading domain come into the math domain by using letters in a numerical or mathematical context, where I found a processing cost for making judgments with letters that have values, and probed a potential mechanism of initial symbol-referent learning. But now I'd like to zoom out and shift to the second part of my talk to think about talk to you about socio-emotional characteristics in math and reading and how they relate to math and reading competence, both within and across domains. So this study I'm doing in collaboration with John Gabrielli and Joanna Christodoulou and both of their teams. So I'll start by talking about motivation, anxiety, and competence, both within and across math and reading. So generally, higher anxiety is associated with lower motivation and lower competence, and lower motivation is associated with lower competence in both the math domain and the reading domain. But there's an asymmetry seemingly in the literature where there appears to be more of a focus on math anxiety and opposite of that, in the reading domain, there seems to be more focus on reading motivation. So there are additional open questions about the relations among motivation, anxiety, and competence, even within these domains. But we're also interested in understanding why motivation and anxiety in one domain may relate to competence in another domain. And I'll give you a few reasons why. Math and reading skills are connected, and they're connected already in young children. I and others have done work that has shown that there's shared functional neural correlates for across math and reading skills, particularly arithmetic and phonological processing. Children with reading disabilities struggle with fact fluency, and there's a high co-occurrence of math and reading learning disabilities. So all of these relations for between the math and reading domains suggest that there may also be relations for socio-emotional characteristics as well. So in order to test this, we asked the research question, how do motivation and anxiety in math and reading relate to math and reading competence within and across domains? And we recruited about 150 children, 8 to 13 years old. And we really were interested in recruiting across the full range of performance, both within those who would be considered to have learning disabilities in math or reading or both, and those outside of that range. So these participants completed standardized assessments. There were 2 assessments of math and 2 assessments of reading. Broad math was a broader measure that encompassed calculation and fact fluency, and also more problem solving, whereas the fact fluency measure was really focused on arithmetic fact fluency across operations. And then we had 2 measures of reading and pseudo word reading, both timed and untimed. And I've put in parentheses here the range of age standard scores on these measures to show that we were able to successfully recruit across the full spectrum of performance. Participants also completed socio-emotional measures, and aligned with the asymmetry that I was mentioning a moment ago, we started with a measure for math anxiety and a measure for reading motivation, and we wanted to have parallel measures across math and reading. So for example, we started with the math anxiety measure and we created the reading anxiety measure to match, but substituting in, adapting it to take out the kind of math specific language and putting in the reading specific language. And we did the same for starting with the reading motivation survey for creating the math motivation survey. And then we also included some covariates. We wanted to look at these relations, controlling for age and gender and nonverbal cognitive ability. And we found that socio-emotional characteristics predicted competence both within and across domains. So I'm going to show you a table and then step through some of the most interesting to us, I think, findings related to this table. So these 4 columns each represent one regression model, a final regression model in a set for each outcome. So there are the outcomes across the top. And then our predictors of interest here, the anxiety and motivation measures are in the first column on the left. And then down here, I've just included whether or not these models include covariates, and there are some other statistics down at the bottom. And so one thing I'd like to note about this table is that I included math anxiety, although you'll notice it's not a statistically significant predictor or a predictor in any of these models. And I just wanted to note that after considering anxiety and motivation across these two domains, math anxiety did not surface as a statistically significant predictor of any of our outcomes. So a couple findings that I'd like to highlight here. One is within domain, motivation was a stronger predictor of competence than anxiety was. And I just mentioned a little bit about that, but looking at the first box on the left, you see that math motivation was a predictor for both, a statistically significant predictor for both math outcomes, and reading motivation was a statistically significant predictor for the reading outcomes, while anxiety was not within each domain. And then second, we found a unidirectional across domain relation. So what I mean by that is socio-emotional characteristics for reading predicted math competence. So in the first column for broad math, we see that reading motivation and anxiety jointly predict broad math, even controlling for math motivation and our other covariates. And for math fluency, reading anxiety was a statistically significant predictor of math fluency, also controlling for math motivation and our other covariates in the model. So what might these relations suggest? I'll offer a few ideas here. First, we did find interrelations among math and reading domains. So I talked before about the different ways that the math and reading domains seem to be interconnected. And so we show that this also includes socio-emotional dimensions. We've also heard, or learned that good reading skills may facilitate not just reading skills, but math skills. And similarly, how learners feel about reading may facilitate not just their reading skills or relate to their reading skills, but also their math skills, which is an interesting implication of these findings or suggestion. And also that how socio-emotional characteristics of reading relate to math skills may be task dependent. So a moment ago, I said that both reading anxiety and reading motivation jointly predicted broad math, whereas reading anxiety, but not reading motivation, predicted math fluency. And so it may be that broad math engages reading and anxiety through connections between written language and math problems from the kind of broader measure of math that this is, versus math fluency, which may engage reading anxiety through shared underlying mechanisms of arithmetic and reading skills, for example, retrieval fluency. So just to sum up some final thoughts, I've talked about kind of two areas of work. The first, really kind of zooming in to focus on a particular aspect of math where you bring letters into a math or numerical context. And I showed that there's a processing cost for judgments with these letters, potentially due to initial learning. And so this has raised several interesting questions for me for further consideration. So could it be that, what is it about this prior knowledge even that might cause difficulty? So one idea could be letters have verbal labels, right? Q, R, et cetera, where these novel symbols do not. And so can that facilitate performance for some people, or is that itself the hindrance? That's an open question. And I want to kind of wildly speculate or sort of make kind of a leap to say, if it may be the case that just having a letter in a math context, because of these prior associations, creates difficulties for learners, or even for those who have many years of experience in math, what about introducing novel symbols in authentic math contexts? And might performance be different if the focus is trying to introduce a particular type of math conception, math concept? So that is an area that I'm interested in exploring moving forward. And then second, I talked about, kind of zoomed out to talk about relations among the math and reading domains and showed that they include socio-emotional dimensions. And motivation surfaced as a strong predictor within domains. And so I wonder if we might want to think more carefully about paying more attentive to motivation. So for example, when I think about something like efforts to reduce math anxiety, might we couple that with reducing anxiety and improving motivation? And might that be a fruitful question to pursue for further research? And then also, our study was cross-sectional. And so it would be interesting to think about how these across domain relations, or this from reading socio-emotional characteristics, might relate to math, and how these relations might persist or interact over time. Because within domain, prior research has shown kind of reciprocal relations over time. So I'm going to end there, and I just want to say such a big thank you to my mentors and my many mentors and colleagues and research assistants. And I'm truly grateful for the work that I've been able to do, and all the wonderful folks that I've been able to do it with. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to chat or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It was an amazing talk. Please feel free to put your questions down in the chat. And there is one question from Dr. Booth. He asked, what are the intercorrelations between math and reading anxiety and motivations? I was also curious about this. Are the previous effects in math anxiety due to its confound with motivation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to clarify, the correlations between math reading and anxiety and motivation, I can speak to also with respect to what we found. So what was interesting is that when we look at just kind of zero order correlations among anxiety and motivation and competence, both within and across domain, we see statistically significant correlations in almost all cases. And they're kind of in the direction that you would expect, where greater anxiety is associated with lower motivation and with lower competence. And that is both within and across domain. But some of these correlations seem to, they don't persist once you're controlling for other factors. And so the second part of the question, are the previous effects in math anxiety due to its confound with motivation? So in the literature, I've found that some studies that look at relations between math anxiety and math competence do include motivation and show some, I want to make sure I get this right, but there is some mediation effects in some prior studies, but not all studies. And so one of the things that we were thinking in relation to this study was, if you're interested in looking at one or the other of these, or if you're interested in looking at math anxiety, maybe also including measures of math motivation. Some studies have done this, but maybe additional studies moving forward should attend more to motivation as well. Thanks for the question.
That was a great answer. I'm still waiting for other questions. Please feel free. If you have any questions, just put in the chat. Actually, I have one more question.
Sure.
So yeah, you talked about intercorrelations between math and reading anxiety and motivations, but actually I'm also wondering about the correlation between anxiety and motivations. Usually students have a like higher anxiety, have a lower motivation. So there are any trends about like that? Yeah, I just want to know.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So we did find and this was also consistent with the literature that you mentioned, where we see higher right, so higher anxiety being associated with lower motivation, and so it would be interesting, I think. So our outcomes here were, both the anxiety and motivation measures within and across domain were predicting these competence outcomes, right? But I think it would be really interesting to take a different approach where we might be able to look at sort of the interrelations of all of them, particularly if we were able to do that over time. So I know that there are questions, that this study didn't speak to, but questions about, kind of which way does the causal arrow go? And I mentioned a little bit that it's really, probably this kind of bidirectionality. And so it would be nice to be able to also think about kind of putting all of, to look at the relations among sort of all of these simultaneously.
Mm. Yeah, and if I add more, sorry for all the questions, but uh, if you talked about the shared mechanisms between reading domains and math domains, but if you predict the neural mechanisms underlying those like interactions between motivations and anxiety, and then do you have any hypotheses on like how brain will like intercorrelate with those in those aspects, in I mean like socio-emotional aspects?
Yeah, that's such an excellent question. I'm 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 not sure. I think one of the, if we're thinking about trying to go across domains, one of the challenges, which I know I mentioned already, but just to circle back, is this kind of asymmetry in the literature, where when you're going across domains, it's really there are very few studies, for example, that have used reading anxiety. It's pretty understudied. A lot of the prior literature that involves anxiety measures in reading is like trait or general anxiety. Um, but there are some neuroimaging studies related to math anxiety, but they're just outside the bounds of my wheelhouse, sort of enough that I shouldn't speculate, I think. But I do think it would be a really interesting question
Yeah.
to think about adding a kind of cog neuro sort of dimension to this work. So thank you for that idea.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your great answer. While we were waiting, we were talking, like there were two questions in the chat. The first one was, some elementary math curricula introduced the concept of unknown with an empty box instead of a letter. Like straight plus empty box is like 4, as opposed to straight plus X is 4. How might this approach extend to higher grades? That was the question. And would it perhaps expand entry points into algebraic thinking?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I have kind of a few different thoughts related to this. I know that I've seen the kind of 3 plus, square or something equals 4 as opposed to X. And I really want to dive more into early algebra to understand a bit more about that. From the kind of the perspective of the work that I've been doing, I think about shapes as kind of this in-between category between these novel symbols and letters, because shapes also have strong prior associations and they also have names, but they're not quite used, they're used in different ways than letters are. And so maybe that would be something I'd be interested in testing. If I can kind of just kind of speculate wildly here, I would say let's say that the empty box kind of does solve this problem of children seeing letters in math and not and having difficulty with that. I think that that the question asker is exactly right, at least in terms of my speculation, in that if you remove some of the barriers of getting bogged down from the notation or the symbols, then are you able to more easily focus on the actual algebraic thinking, right? Maybe you're looking at like the commutative property or sort of inverse operations or something like that, and maybe it's easier to do when you're able to kind of reduce some of the extraneous barriers. So that would be my hypothesis there, but of course I would need to test it.
And there is one more question from Asha. So how might stereotypes, threats, and associated anxiety inform these findings in diverse populations?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think this is a great topic for future work because you could think about how you could measure stereotype threat and you could measure along with anxiety, and I think then try to yeah it's a really good question. I think it's something I'd like to think more about, but I definitely, because we know that stereotype threat is associated with performance differences, levels of stereotype threat, it seems to me that it would be another really important consideration to include. I know that there are some relations in the literature that show gender differences in things like math anxiety and math performance and the relation between those. And I think that stereotype threat could act as an important moderator potentially for some of these relations.
And I think it may be the last question, I guess. Practically, one more question from Analia. Practically speaking, do you see any direct application for these links you found between math reading anxiety and competence? For example, could earlier exposure to math symbols and concepts or more integrated curriculums for math and reading be beneficial?
Yeah, thank you for that question. These are such great ideas. Yeah, I wonder about earlier exposure to math symbols. And I think relating this question to one of the previous questions, how something like earlier exposure to math symbols and math concepts may even be in tension with each other in some ways. Like, can we introduce some more easier introductions into algebraic thinking if we're able to remove some of the symbolic challenges, if there are some. So there are some ways in which these might actually be sort of in tension with one another. And yeah, I'd really like to think more about this question or comment about integrated curricula for math and reading, and more, think more about like what that might look like or how we might draw on these two domains. Because I can also think about it in the opposite way, which is what if we know that someone maybe has a lot of reading anxiety or who struggles a lot with reading. What about an approach to math that actually is more separated from reading or some of the underlying component skills? So again, I think there might be some ways that we could think about how these might be in tension with one another. But thank you for that question. It's really interesting.
I guess that was our last question. Thank you so much for the amazing talk, Dr. Pollack, Courtney. And I think it's time to finish. Once again, we will transitions to Dr. Uncapher. Again, if you have any questions, Dr. Uncapher, during the talk, please feel free to put them in the chat. During the talk, you can put them in the chat anytime, and we will visit them after the talk.
Thank you so much. I seem to have lost my my slides, so sorry, one sec, friends. So funny. Leave it to a multitasking researcher to not be able to multitask on her. Here, let me do this again. All right. Can you guys see my slides?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, they're up.
Thank you. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Courtney, for that compelling conversation. That was great. And thank you to IMBES, of course, for this award. It's really just an honor to be speaking toward the incredible mission of this field leading society, especially in a time of increasing divisiveness. It's really inspiring to see how every single one of you are using your platforms of influence to really bring folks together to solve really important problems. So now more than ever, as you all know, it's really critical for us to be leading from these intersectional spaces. And IMBES has been truly a field leader in the intersectional space that includes researchers and educators who all have the power to change the world together. So I'm really excited to share with you all about a vision that can really only be realized within this intersectional space. And this is a vision that we've been breathing life into for the last couple of years. It's a vision where we bring the very best of what we know from research about how students learn and the very best of what we know about how great teachers teach, and bring those insights together to build great products and programs that can reveal the brilliance of students, particularly those students who've been the most excluded and marginalized. So today I am delighted to share the stage with some leaders at the front line of this work who will each share their perspectives on how they're working towards bringing this big, bold goal into reality. Dr. Curtis Taylor, you'll hear from after me, who's an educator who's helped us shape our program actually from the beginning, and Dr. David Webb, who is one of our researchers, who will discuss how his work has been significantly up-leveled by working with Curtis and other educators. So let me start by grounding us in our core theory of action. So we all know that we know more today than ever before about how children learn and develop. We know from breakthroughs in neuroscience, cognitive science, child development, they're all providing basic insights that could really lead to stronger learning and life outcomes for students. But we also know that the education sector really struggles to translate this knowledge into practices, resources, and tools for classrooms. So we built our program, EF Plus Math, to strengthen our collective capacity as a field to build on what we know from the science of learning and development to create better approaches that can really push all of our thinking about what's possible for student learning and opportunity. And our approach is called inclusive R&D, research and development, because diverse teams of educators, researchers, and developers work together on equal footing from the beginning and with each of their particular expertise and perspectives represented and respected equally. And why we think that's important is because even the very best models at play are still really siloed, right? With research insights most often developed in the lab, then handed over to folks to turn into products and programs, and finally handed off to educators to see if and how they work in the real world at the very end of the process. And so this not only isolates the expertise from all three of these fields, but it also takes a long time, right? It can lose an entire generation through the K-12 system in this linear model. So our approach is really to collapse this linear model into a more inclusive model that brings all three fields to the table at the same time. So we can not only speed up the discovery process, but also make better discoveries because we all have the wisdom at the table at the same time. So with this in mind, we launched the EF Plus Math program about 2 years ago to demonstrate the value of pointing the engine of innovation that is R&D, research and development, toward tackling some of the hairiest problems in education. We started with math, given how critical we know math to be for success in school and in life, and given how we're nowhere near where we need to be in providing high quality, rigorous math instruction to our Black and Latino students and students experiencing poverty. So the big, bold goal of our program is to significantly increase the number of our priority students who are proficient or advanced in math. And why this matters to me personally is because I've been truly just awed by the power of the brain, having spent 20 plus years seeing brains in action, transforming themselves literally during learning. And I never cease to be amazed by the power that every single brain holds. These brains that are learning every single second of every single day are just absolutely incredible. And that's why we think there's a shot at achieving this big, bold goal, because there's a compelling research base that's revealing a specific and untapped lever in math learning. And that's a set of skills that every learner has, but isn't necessarily explicitly taught in school, your executive function skills. Your EF skills really are what allow you to focus on what's important and ignore distractions, allow you to think flexibly to solve problems, and they allow you to keep track of ideas in your mind. And so perhaps not surprisingly, they're strongly related to math skills. But what's even more compelling is that if you look at these national data according to household income, you can see that this so-called math gap that we worry so much about between students from high and low income households, it's almost non-existent when you look at students with strong executive function skills. So this here is our powerful pointer to the idea that strong EF skills may actually have a protective effect and help really overcome the challenges of learning math in under-resourced schools. So what we've done is assemble a really compelling crew of R&D teams, around 250 folks in total, that are building on this compelling research base and are prototyping new ways to accelerate math learning by embedding executive skill building within rigorous mathematics instruction. And critically, our teams are each revealing what we think to be the power and promise of inclusive R&D, because they're building tools that are grounded in rigorous research, that deeply center equity from the beginning and throughout the entire process, and that are designed with educators at the core of the work. And so to underscore that last pillar of inclusive R&D, centering or leading really with educator voice, the very first thing we did was to assemble a rockstar group of math educators from around the country who all serve our priority students and are all equity and justice champions. And you'll hear from one of them next, which we're so excited about. And each one of them have been deep thought partners as we've shaped the program. And now every single one of them is embedded in an R&D team as key leaders of the work. And so our intentional community of about 250 researchers, educators, and designers have been working together to what we think could truly change the face of math instruction. The community themselves really centers on the backbone of what we call our Designing for Use work, which is really led by our educators. So our Educator Leadership Council, and then the public school districts that the R&D teams partner with. And these districts are highly diverse across the country, ranging from public schools in Newark, New Jersey, to Middletown, Ohio, to Vista, California, and beyond. And so all of these educators are engaging in co-design cycles with research teams to jointly figure out ways to bring the best of what we know from research around how to build strong math learners and trial new ideas about how to strengthen executive function skills while teaching rigorous mathematics. And so some of the math prototypes that our educators helped us select really sit in our sweet spot, right? They help us solve real world problems while simultaneously advancing the relevant learning science. And so you can see here that they're all actually making complementary shots on goal for how to accelerate math learning by building executive function skills. So some are using game-based interactive graphic novels to build math and EF skills. Others are using embodied cognition principles to teach math on the basketball court and in the classroom. And I'll hand it off next to one of our teams to speak directly from the educator view and the researcher view about their co-design process for the prototype that they're building. So all in all, we've just assembled a stellar community of scholars, practitioners, and designers who all share a vision for how to lift up the brilliance of students and for how to build new tools that really affirm the brilliance of students who've been historically excluded and underserved. And we all recognize in this community and on this call that we can't simply retrofit existing systems, right? But instead we have to really redesign systems to specifically center students who have been excluded, because students are already equipped with the skills that they need to learn anything, particularly rigorous math. And our students deserve to be challenged with the very best resources and opportunities. So these transformative projects are taking truly an unapologetic focus on affirming the brilliance that really already exists in each student by building these research-informed, student-centered math learning systems. So with that framing of our program, I am thrilled to turn it over to one of the core leaders of this work, Dr. Curtis Taylor. He is an in-service practitioner serving as a math improvement coach at High Tech High in San Diego, and is also a member of our Educator Leadership Council. So he's embedded in an incredible R&D team, which he will tell you about now. So over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Melina. Good morning, Melina. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Once again, I'm Dr. Curtis Taylor, and I gladly serve as an ELC member within the AF Plus Math Initiative. First, I would like to just share about the joy of this experience of the co-design process has been not only for me as an educator, but also an early researcher. Before diving into this joy, I would like to ground this joy from a quote from Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. Love states, joy is crucial for social change. Joy is crucial for teaching. Finding joy in the midst of pain and trauma is the fight to be fully human. A revolutionary spirit that embraces joy, self-care, and love is moving toward wholeness, and acknowledging joy is to make yourself aware of your humanity, creativity, self-determination, power, and ability to love abundantly. And so this is the type of the joy that the co-design process with Spark Math has created throughout our first year together. And so if you are able to advance the slide, thank you, Melina. Our collective joy began with the alignment of our equity goals, so our equity North Stars. So as a collective, we worked to craft an equity charter together that was very true to the work that we wanted to accomplish with our district partners, the students that we will be serving, and keeping us accountable to the necessary work of pushing mathematics education forward. Because of our alignment with our equity vision, this allowed for us to experience this joy that Love talks about in her book. I was able to learn more about game design, curriculum design. Conversely, I was able to offer my team insights with what the work of a math educator demands, from the theoretical to the practical. And so we were able to pull from each other's strengths and skills that allowed us to experience our full humanity in the work, but also allowed us to move to innovation of ideas. And the ideas that were centered around moving our Black and Brown and low-income students forward. So very, very insightful ideas. And so with that, I want to talk a little bit more about my participation in the co-design teams and the co-design cycles that Melina was talking about. So if you move to the next slide. For our Black and Brown and low-income students to move forward in mathematics, culturally relevant mathematics teaching has to be a priority. And so through the co-design process, as an educator myself, I was able to help guide the team in their thinking around culturally relevant mathematics. And so the first co-design team that I participated in, we focused on EF-infused math games to help support a student understanding of ratios and expressions. Well, the example shown here is focused on expressions, and we actually took this from my own practice of a teacher of starting to build the conceptual understanding of algebraic expressions by using the border problem, which is a wonderful problem that has been used for years and very highlighted on Joe Bowler's UQ page. So the example is this: it's commonly the border problem is very commonly known, and the activity just demonstrates means of helping to facilitate the conceptual understanding as students think of equivalent ways of representing the problem. So now we're starting to work with students' information processing cycles and having students to grapple with the mathematics so they can build sense making for themselves. And then from there, we want to move into the procedural understanding. And this is where we are deepening the students' mathematical thinking and starting to close those learning gaps that happens for many of our Black and Brown and low-income students in mathematics. So on the next slide, you start to see, hey, we went from the conceptual to now thinking about, when we're modifying or gamifying this particular problem now, we are able to modify it into a game that progressively get more challenging for the students to stretch their cognitive muscles, but also include EF game cards that help students to build their metacognition of their own executive function skills. And then from there, we took, once again, culturally relevant teaching. We all, if we go to the next slide, Melina, we all have played goldfish at some point in our life. So now that we move from the conceptual understanding and having students think about their EF functioning skills, we want them to now put into practice the procedural understanding. And what great ways to do it through playing a game that's very familiar to them. And then the last co-design team that I participated in was very focused on the development of the curriculum or the replacement units that my friend will very much speak upon after this. I wanted to highlight this quote from the work of Jamal Matthews, who is also part of our team, as it helped focus on what our students are needing from their math experience, and it helped to lead our work or to push our work further than the traditional linear units that we see in much of today's mathematics scope and sequence or curriculum that schools tend to use. And so I just want to read this quote for just a moment for us so we can get grounded and then move into what we saw as important for this work. So I mean, just like the way math is taught, really, it's pretty much you do this, and there's no creativity. It's just this. You will never be asked to try to create your own formula or try to do anything or use your own formula, see if it works. It just, you learn this formula, you do this formula, and that's it. And so this quote was so impactful for us because it allowed us to see how actually aware students are of their agency or lack thereof in the existing curriculum. And so I'm going to pass this to my friend David, Dr. David Webb, who has his PhD in curriculum and instruction in math education. He works very much in the Spark Math program, but also he's an associate professor at University of Colorado Boulder and has been such a wonderful partner to work with, a thought partner, a friend, and he's going to continue to share a little bit more about our work together.
Thank you so much, Curtis, and great to be here. It's great to be part of the team. I think what Curtis had mentioned at the outset, there is really a true joy in working together, and part of it is what we learn from each other. The opportunities to listen and not just always do, try to get things done, but to sit back, listen, and to try to take ideas into account to create something that's going to be more powerful and impactful. So my background, as Curtis mentioned, is as a math educator in curriculum and professional development. And as a co-PI on the Spark Math team, I was charged, we were charged, but I was leading this effort on co-designing for replacement units, so-called replacement units that integrate executive function and mathematics. I had some knowledge of executive function going into this. Certainly I know about some related aspects of executive function, but having a strong executive function team working on this project, again, more opportunities to learn, to grow, to become a better educator. So I was really looking forward to this work. At the heart of this effort is enabling students to explore math in contexts that are meaningful to them, and as individuals, and in the process build confidence in their executive function abilities and experience a sense of belonging in their math class. You kind of see laid out here some key principles. Now, along the way, we're designing professional learning for and with teachers that explore effective ways for getting to know students deeply. And I think that's one of the things that's lacking in math classes typically. As we get to the content, we need to get to know our students. And I think that was brought really to the fore this year during the pandemic. More teachers were leaning in across K through university, getting to know their students. And so we're really, we're diving into this work to design materials to make the connection between how getting to know students supports belongingness and students' engagement in math. Next slide. So our co-design process included many discussions among the Spark Math research and development team, including Curtis and Jen, who are part of the Ed Leadership Council. We've also involved district and school administrators and math teachers. And this Jamboard slide is one example of how we invited everyone to contribute to a community charter where our various commitments and hopes and dreams were articulated. And this was something that was organized by the EF Plus Math team as something that's important to do. And so we just embraced it. And what a process. You can kind of see, hopefully you can kind of see the expression of joy and enthusiasm even in this Jamboard. But this particular commitment to equity shows the extent to which designing according to students' interests, voice, and engagement is key to this work. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So with this in mind, the school partners conducted a survey of students that focused on their hopes and interests for math education. This particular prompt asked students, what motivates you in school? So in addition to what we typically do with co-design in terms of working with teachers and administrators, for a time, we wanted to really know the interests of students. We needed more of the student voice in the process. And so this survey influenced our ideas about, what we might think about students versus what students are really sharing with us. So this was important. And if you go to the next slide, this also gave us the chance to collect qualitative information. We had students put themselves in the mindset of game designers building a new math game, and learned how many of them were interested in opportunities for agency as well as competition, but also cooperation with peers. So really, really involving students in the co-design process as much as possible. And that's challenging during the last 16 months, but we've been doing it. And thank goodness our school partners have really been able to draw upon students' interests and sharing that back to the team so it can influence the directions we go. Next slide. One of the most rewarding parts of this co-design process is also, as I mentioned, our opportunity to learn from each other. And in a recent co-design meeting, we had an opportunity to discuss content goals and revisit shared hopes and design principles for these math units. Yeah, go ahead and cycle through the next steps. So Curtis made some connections between the Spark math design principles that we were talking through, and that's good right there, and Goldie Muhammad's historically responsive literacy framework. And personally, I was not familiar with this, but what was really cool is just how this theoretical lens for equity informed our design process going forward. So when we started thinking about the problem context and the content, we were working through the different constructs here. Certainly skills and intellect is part of what we do in terms of designing math units. Probably the way intellect is defined here is more expansive, certainly leans more on student engagement than we typically cast as reasoning or habits of mind. But these other two on the kind of upper left and lower right, identity and criticality, really, to what extent are we designing resources for teachers and students that explicitly focus on student identity, how they see themselves in school and in math ed, and then criticality. Are we giving them opportunities to read the world with mathematics? This lens is a present reminder to us to include opportunities for student voice and choice, to choose relevant contexts. It motivates our desire to know more about students. To really, we're kind of hungering to know. We need to know more about students and to design ways to get to know that not only for ourselves in the design process, but for the teachers who are going to be using these units. Going to the next slide. So this also led to a discussion of the need to have something that lives beyond the classroom. And certainly Curtis, Jamal, and others like, it'd be really cool if this is just more than just doing math, just doing a math unit. So we wanted something that students would be able to work on, projects, which we used to do way back in math education, but for some reason lost our way. And I mean, going back into the 90s, there was a lot of work in authenticity and authentic instruction and authentic assessment. And I was familiar with that work. And so it allowed us to kind of reframe kind kind of some of the, again, the hopes and dreams for what this experience will be in Spark Math for students as we start even thinking about problem context, questions, opportunities for students to show what they know, opportunities for students to make choices in terms of how they're going to show what they know. And again, this idea of, you know, it would be nice if some of these ideas could live beyond the school. They're not just doing something for the teacher. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So a couple examples of school context, problem context that we are working on. One is the one listed here, planning a school event. And this is one that came up even before the co-design process, where we started really leaning into more of the context. So I don't know if Curtis knew that, but we kind of, oh, man, what would be some good problem context where students could actually design something? And it would be really nice, certainly, if students could actually design a school event that actually happened. But this particular context was a way to have students look at ratios and rates, unit rates, shopping. There's a whole host of things we can do in terms of having students analyze and organize information in the context of this project. And students who work in teams to maybe develop proposals for different iterations of maybe the school event. But then what was interesting is, as part of the co-design process that came about after this, if you go to the next slide, then this one came out. And what was really interesting is that on the team, when social media was proposed as a context, just the way everyone's eyes kind of lit up and started imagining the different ways this could be used as a context for that is likely more engaging, more relevant, and of interest to students. I mean, it's provocative, and we're talking about grade 6 students, so a lot of grade 6 students aren't allowed to have accounts, but there's ways to talk about this. They know about this, they hear about this, but it can motivate big questions, big idea questions like, how does something go viral? And what does that mean from a mathematical point of view, but even just from a, almost an experiential point of view? And then, is social media good? So it gets to the criticality piece. Who does it help or hurt? What are things you have to be mindful of? And then related to identity, who am I? And how do I want to present myself online? What's my identity online? So this is a problem context that this wouldn't have emerged unless it was part of the co-design process. I'm pretty certain of that. But this is something we're working on as part of units involving early algebra and also ratios. Last slide. So because of the co-design process and the expertise and guidance of the EF plus math team, we just had some wonderful people that we're working with, and we look forward to working with them going forward. We're now in a place design-wise that is a bit different than when we submitted the proposal for this work. So it speaks to how the co-design process has been working for us and our better understanding of the field, who we're going to be working with, our audience for this work, our collaborators in this work. So you can kind of see here at the top, our vision for Spark Math is for us to incorporate, for us and teachers to incorporate students' funds of knowledge and strength in executive functioning to enable them to make sense of math through their lived experiences. This, I think, encapsulates where we are in the co-design process and how this informs our vision going forward. I'll pass it back to Melina.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, friends. That is just one example of the 11 teams that we are supporting through EF plus Math, and just the incredible kind of brilliance and creativity that comes through when you bring educators, researchers, students, and designers together. And this is really just the beginning. We're actually only in our first year of the work, and we've got 4 more to go. So we look forward to working with all of you guys and hearing your great big ideas around how to move this forward. But why don't I pass it back to Yunji? Actually, before I do that, I do want to give a big shout out to some of the EF plus Math program team members who are on the call. We've got Dr. Karen Lang, Dr. Adam Smith, Dr. Deb Lindo, all just incredible, incredible leaders of this work. And we are a very inclusive leadership type of program. So none of this would be workable at all without all of you on the team who are on the call. So over to you, Yunji. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the great presentations. What an exciting program and huge program. Can't wait to see what's going to happen next. So please feel free to put your questions down in the chat. While we are waiting, I think I have one questions to you guys.
Sure.
So it's such a huge program, and I think approach and the program will be differ a lot depending on the domains of math and students' age ranges, like grades. So I'm wondering how you select domains of math that Spark Math focuses on, and also age target.
Yeah, it's a great question. Why don't I tee it up, and then I can pass it over to Curtis and David to talk specifically about Spark Math. So for EF plus Math as a program whole, we focused very specifically on middle years, so grades 3 through 8, just given the kind of developmental vulnerability and opportunity of executive function skill development, as well as mathematics skill development. And also grade 3 is really where we start to ask more complex mathematics things of our students. And we take a very asset-based perspective and know that our students can do really rigorous mathematics if asked. And so that's really kind of the inflection point that we wanted to start with. And then right about at the cusp of adolescence, that's a whole other, as you know, a whole other ball of wax. So wanted to constrain it to grades 3 through 8. But then the Spark Math team, if you want to talk about your grades and the rationale for the age ranges that you're thinking of.
Yeah, you mentioned content. So for grade 6, part of this work is informed by what grade level content expectations are as a starting point, but that's not limiting to just that. Certainly early middle school, and I was a former middle school teacher, so I'm pretty familiar with the content expectations. But certainly ratios, rates, proportionality is significant in grade 6, but there's certainly threads of early algebra, expressions and formulas, statistics, not so much probability, but some measurement as well. Measurement cast as geometry. So I mean, the content is always going to be there as part of the units we develop, but how we intersect the presentation of those ideas and allow students to share their strategies within that space to learn more about prior knowledge and connections that can be made to more further abstractions of math. And that's kind of key to how we're designing this.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on to that, David, too, ratio and algebraic is thinking is such a prominent, two prominent concepts within just the mathematical scope of just K through 12. And so a lot of students who tend to not do well further up in their level of mathematics proficiency is because of some breakdown in that thinking of ratio thinking and algebraic thinking. And so that's a cornerstone of the math focus that we wanted to work on.
Yeah, I was excited about the idea, because in my PhD, I studied ratio and fractions and how children learn about that. So yeah, that was an exciting topic. We are still, while we're waiting our other questions, may I ask one more? So I learned in my PhD that the view of math and cognitive science kind of differ, when we think about math, such as ratio. When we think about ratio, in the cognitive science, we can see just as a people can perceive, can see ratio as a magnitude, but on the other side, in math, they more empathize on the multiplicative relations between numerator and denominator. So like I think there will be like some different thoughts between like EF math and the Spark math, like because they takes different view. So how do you guys like resolve those different thoughts?
Great question. Again, I'll tee it up, but would love to hear from both David and Curtis about this. It's such a, it's a cultural question, right? There's very different kind of, inroads into how we think about mathematics teaching and learning. And, from my side, I came from, neuroscience, cognitive science background, so different from a math ed background. And it's crazy to me that we don't have more crosstalk. And that's actually part of the impetus for building this program, is to get folks who are across lines of difference, even what seems like such an arbitrary difference as to how, the inroad that you're taking to study how someone learns or teaches math. But so even within the scholar community, there's tons of lines of difference that we're intentionally putting together and building systems and ways to communicate to across these boundaries. So we are very strong advocates of boundary science, where we know there are boundary actors, there's boundary language, there's boundary objects, and just thinking about how you use that those principles to get scholars to talk to each other, to get scholars and educators to talk to each other, scholars and educators and designers to talk to each other, and to buy into and own a shared vision that is not actually about the boundary. It's about respecting the fact that coming from two different lines of thinking actually builds a better vision. And rather than trying to rectify these differences, we celebrate and kind of elevate these differences. And so it's one of the reasons that we have 11 different R&D teams. They're not all testing the same hypotheses about how to embed executive function skills in the context of learning rigorous mathematics. And that's great. We want it all. We want to make sure that we are really, again, celebrating the diversity of perspectives and expertise. But curious how that's felt for you, David and Curtis.
Curtis, you see across a few projects, right? Or you're working with more than Spark Math. So maybe if you could give your perspective, and I'll dive deeper into just Spark Math specific.
Well, I feel like Melina did a wonderful job of like sharing exactly what it is in the process of like the hypothesis. So like I do a lot. My main work is with Smart Math and working with that team, and then I have done a couple of consulting work with QThink, which is also another part of the grant. And they both have very different ideas and hypotheses, like Melina talked about, of like how to embed EF plus math, where QThink is thinking, oh, let's have pretty much a platform where students are going through problem solving and learning the skills of problem solving. So understanding the problem, planning the problem, solving the problem, and then checking. And then also in embedding the EF plus math skills throughout that component. And then the reason my work with them is just also embedding that culturally relevant mathematical tasks that allow students to do more of that grappling and do more of that information processing cycle that we want students to help with. Where on the Spark Math side, we're thinking about, once again, the replacement units, and as well as EF plus math infused games that can also support students throughout these units as well. So there's a different context and different ideas that I think are all very beneficial for students.
Yeah, I'd say thank you, Curtis. I think in terms of kind of what's already been mentioned. I mean, it depends on the makeup of the team, the different perspectives brought to the table, and we have someone with prior work in the game industry, and who's also has expertise in executive function. We have folks who yeah, just bring various ideas to the table about, okay, yeah, we can do the EF plus math games, and we will. I mean, that's almost the low hanging fruit. We've got lots of ideas around that. that can be done apart from these replacement units. But we want them to also be, we want the experience to be contextualized within maybe a coherent unit where students can kind of develop ideas over time, and we can learn how to integrate executive function opportunities within the context of the unit. So that also requires us to figure out how to convey this to teachers, how to build professional learning opportunities, how to build things within the unit where teachers have opportunities to get to know their students better, so that they can make appropriate adjustments, adaptations, and follow students' interests more, rather than always feeling like there's a curriculum they have no authority over. So yeah, I think it varies, and the kinds of things that are going to be coming out from this project are pretty exciting. And I've been doing curriculum work for 25 years. I am super excited about where we're going with this. So
Yeah, I'm excited too. Yeah, as one of advocate to bring neuroscience, like cognitive science to educations, I'm really excited like what's gonna happen next. Thank you for all the discussions. That was like great conversations with you guys. Do you guys have anything, any topics you'd like to discuss, like before we wrap the talk? Like we can do that. Like, do you have anything like to empathize? Like,
You should never toss that up to researchers, because
yeah, that's true.
no, I think in closing would just love to again thank IMBES for this award of exemplifying the mission. So you can see really clearly how they are living the mission of bringing educator voice deeply into the research, and how that can help us not only refine our research questions and research methods, but really help build products and programs and things that are useful and usable for kids that really deserve it. They deserve the best of what we know from learning science, the best of what we know from teaching practice, and the best of what we know about how to build things that reach the kids that have been historically not designed for. So we're just thrilled for IMBES to exist and to help build the ecosystem of this work. And just thank you to Curtis and David for all the incredible work that you're doing and showing us all how it's done. So appreciate it.
I just have one more thing to add.
Yes.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. I work with some wonderful faculty here at Colorado, and it turns out Bill Penuel is my office mate. He does work design-based implementation research and certainly RPP work. But he mentioned this notion at a conference here not too far long ago called infrastructuring. The work that's needed to make these things happen, and how that influences basically structures within schools, among research communities. And it was mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and as it was articulated in terms of how the Education Council came together. But the space that Spark Math specifically is given to have these conversations and invited to, yeah, we know you want to do these units. We know you want to design these games. We know you're going to be working with, but step back for a moment, learn from each other, listen to each other. We often don't have time to do that in the research community. You get the funding and you're off and running. But I just really appreciate the EF Plus Math Group for honoring that space, the co-design process, that it takes a while to figure these things out from each other. And for also creating a community where I've met some wonderful people as part of EF Plus Math. So it takes that kind of work to make this happen.
Thank you so much all for the great work and great ending statements. And I'd like to, as you might know, this is our last IMBES 2021 virtual conference. Yes. So, and we hugely thanks to all the speakers for their amazing talks and contributions to our conference series. Also, we thanks to all the training members who participated in our training board speech competitions. That was really great. And lastly, again, we'd like to empathize hugely our next year conference, in-person conference. So less than a year left. Hope you see you all in person in the beautiful city like Montreal, Canada. Mark on your calendar, please. And yeah, I'd like to say bye to you all. So thank you again for coming for this conference series.
Thank you.